Welcome to today's deep dive. We're really thrilled to have you here.
Absolutely. It is great to be here.
We have this really dense, honestly fascinating stack of psychiatric and medical material in front of us today. It's completely focused on personality and impulse control disorders.
Yeah, it's a massive topic.
It really is. And to kick things off, there is this historical detail in the material that completely reorients how you think about this whole topic.
The Greek root.
Exactly. The word personality actually derives from the ancient Greek word persona. And persona didn't mean, your soul or your character. It was the literal, physical, theatrical mask worn by dramatic players on stage.
Which is really the perfect framework for what we are exploring today.
Yeah.
I mean, the mission of this deep dive is to look at the clinical architecture behind these invisible masks that people wear every single day.
Right.
And the most crucial concept to internalize right out of the gate is that there is no sharp, clean dividing line separating a normal personality from an abnormal one.
It's not black and white.
Not at all. It exists on a vast continuum.
Yeah.
Actually, a staggering 12.16% of the adult population currently meets the diagnostic criteria for a personality disorder.
Wow. Over 1 in 10 adults.
Yeah. This isn't some rare abstract phenomenon confined to closed psychiatric wards. This is sitting in the cubicle next to you, it's at your family dinner table, and it is highly misunderstood.
Over 1 in 10 adults. That is a massive portion of the population. Okay, let's unpack this. Most of us listening have probably heard buzzwords like narcissist or borderline thrown around casually in conversation or, online.
Yes, ma'am.
But stripping away the pop psychology, how does the clinical framework actually define what makes a personality truly disordered?
So the clinical baseline requires an inflexible, enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior. It has to deviate markedly from cultural expectations.
So it's not just a quirk.
Right. It is pervasive across almost all situations, and it's incredibly stable over time, usually tracing its roots all the way back to adolescence or early adulthood.
Got it.
We aren't talking about a passing depressive episode or a temporary reaction to grief. This is the fundamental, rigid way an individual perceives the fabric of reality, copes with daily stress, and interacts with other human beings.
And the current diagnostic framework organizes these behaviors into 3 major clusters, right?
Yes, exactly, 3 clusters.
The first of these is Cluster A, which is categorized largely as the odd or eccentric disorders. These are individuals living on the far outside of typical social norms.
Very much on the outside.
There are 3 distinct variations here, starting with paranoid personality disorder. But this goes far beyond simply being, a little suspicious or cynical, doesn't it?
Oh, it fundamentally alters their interaction with the world. Individuals with paranoid personality disorder actively misinterpret their environment.
How so?
They operate in a state of hypervigilance, holding these deep, lifelong grudges. Psychologically, they harbor a profound internal sense of vulnerability and powerlessness.
So they feel weak internally.
Yes. And to cope with that terrifying internal state, they project their own unattractive traits or malicious thoughts onto everyone else. Outwardly, they present as hostile, litigious, and abrasive, fully convinced that others are constantly plotting against them.
Man, that sounds exhausting, to just live like that every day.
It is incredibly taxing.
And then you have schizoid personality disorder, which represents a completely different kind of isolation. It's often confused with severe introversion, but the mechanics are entirely different, right?
Right. It is a profound emotional detachment. People with schizoid personality disorder are the ultimate loners, but not because they are anxious. They genuinely appear incapable of forming social bonds.
They just don't have the hardware for it.
Exactly. They gain almost zero psychological or emotional reward from human relationships. While a typical introvert might need a quiet weekend to recharge after a party, someone with schizoid personality disorder would much rather form attachments to mathematics, complex engineering problems, or animals.
The human social component is just missing from their drive.
Entirely missing.
Which brings us to the third one in this group, schizotypal personality disorder. It sounds linguistically similar to schizoid, but the presentation is highly unusual.
Yes, schizotypal is best understood clinically as possessing traits very similar to schizophrenia, but in a less severe, non-psychotic form.
Meaning they aren't having full hallucinations.
Right, but you see significant cognitive and perceptual distortions. They might hold intense magical beliefs or engage in referential thinking.
Meaning they might see a totally random event, like a street lamp flickering, and believe it holds a specific, highly personal message meant only for them.
That is the perfect example. It's a persistent misreading of reality. They also present with highly unusual mannerisms, perhaps wearing heavily mismatched, stained, or completely inappropriate clothing for the weather.
And they suffer from extreme social anxiety too, right?
Yes, extreme social anxiety that does not fade with familiarity.
What's tragic is that if you're listening to those descriptions, your first instinct is probably to wonder why they don't just seek therapeutic help.
Well, what's fascinating here is that the vast majority of these individuals never seek treatment voluntarily.
Really?
Never.
Very rarely.
They might only end up in a clinical setting if mandated by a court order or if they are hospitalized for a secondary issue like severe depression.
Because they don't see the problem.
Exactly. They don't seek help for the core personality disorder because they possess no insight into it. To them, the mask they wear is absolute reality. They don't perceive their worldview as distorted. They genuinely believe the rest of the world is operating incorrectly.
That lack of insight is a heavy concept. Let's shift our focus to cluster B, which is where the internal dysfunction turns outward into highly dramatic, erratic, and emotional behavior. We really want to spend time diving deep into borderline personality disorder, or BPD. The clinical material provides a rather intense case study that paints a vivid picture of what this actually looks like.
Yes, the case study focuses on Rebecca, a 23-year-old woman living alone. Her social patterns are highly chaotic.
In what way?
When she meets someone new, she instantly overshares deeply personal, intimate information. If the new acquaintance doesn't immediately match that extreme intensity, she perceives it as a devastating rejection.
So it's 0 to 60 immediately.
And the most alarming clinical detail in Rebecca's file is that she severely cuts her own wrists, and the precipitating event wasn't a major life tragedy.
Right. It was simply that her therapist went out of town on a scheduled planned vacation.
Yes, a planned vacation.
To anyone outside of that mind, self-harming over a therapist's vacation sounds completely disproportionate. What is the psychological engine driving that kind of extreme reaction?
At its core, BPD is driven by a frantic, consuming fear of abandonment. People with this disorder lack a stable self-image.
They don't really know who they are.
Exactly. When asked to describe themselves, they often report feeling a chronic, echoing internal emptiness. Because they lack a solid internal anchor, their emotional reactivity is entirely dependent on the people around them.
They just mold to whoever is there.
Yes, and they rely heavily on a defense mechanism known as dichotomous thinking.
Often referred to as splitting, which sounds like absolute emotional whiplash for anyone in their orbit.
It is exactly that. Splitting means viewing everyone, partners, friends, therapists, in absolute black and white terms.
So no middle ground.
None. One day you are idealized. You are the perfect savior who will finally rescue them from their emptiness. But the moment you trigger their fear of abandonment, perhaps by setting a boundary or taking a vacation, you are completely devalued.
You become the enemy.
You become an absolute monster. There is no gray area, no concept of a good person who occasionally disappoints me.
I want to focus on the self-harm aspect of Rebecca's story. Why is physical self-mutilation so incredibly prevalent, specifically in borderline personality disorder?
It is a maladaptive, self-soothing mechanism. When the emotional pain and the fear of abandonment reach an intolerable peak, physical pain acts as a pressure valve.
It releases the pressure.
Right. Self-harm forces the body to release endogenous endorphins, which temporarily numb the psychological turmoil. The clinical texts note that this doesn't just look like cutting.
It can be a lot stranger.
Yes, it can manifest in highly unusual, dangerous behaviors, like swallowing staples, pens, or razor blades, or repeatedly banging their head against a wall.
That's horrifying. But it's not just for attention, right?
Not at all. It is rarely a calculated attempt at suicide or attention-seeking. It's a desperate biological attempt to regulate emotions that feel like they're burning them alive.
Which begs the question, how does someone develop this? The clinical literature leans heavily on a framework called the biosocial theory, developed by Dr. Marsha Linehan. I was reading through her breakdown, and it seems to hinge on a very specific recipe of biological vulnerability crashing into a toxic environment.
Linehan's theory is foundational. The biological vulnerability means the individual is simply wired from birth to feel emotions much more intensely, and it takes them significantly longer to return to a baseline calm.
But that alone doesn't create BPD.
No, it has to be paired with an invalidating environment during their developmental years.
The text provides a remarkably subtle example of this. It's not necessarily overt abuse. It describes a 4-year-old girl named Emily.
Yes, the story with her cousin.
Right. Her family is preparing to visit relatives, and Emily says, I am not going. I hate my cousin Stevie. Her parents immediately shut her down, saying, You do not hate Stevie. He is a wonderful boy, and only a spoiled, selfish little girl would say such a thing.
That is the textbook definition of chronic invalidation. To an outsider, it just looks like a parent trying to enforce good manners.
Right. Just standard parenting.
But when this happens constantly to a highly sensitive child, they learn a devastating lesson. They cannot trust their own physical and emotional reality.
Because they're being told their internal reality is wrong.
Exactly. They're taught that their internal feelings are objectively wrong and make them a bad person. Eventually, they stop trying to process complex emotions and instead oscillate between completely deadening their feelings and having explosive, uncontrollable outbursts.
Fortunately, the clinical prognosis for BPD has shifted significantly thanks to targeted treatments like dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. It directly tackles that lack of emotional regulation by teaching tangible grounding skills.
A primary example is the five senses exercise.
How does that work?
Well, because self-harm is an attempt to physically ground oneself using pain, DBT teaches patients to use safe sensory inputs instead. If the emotional spiral starts, they might be instructed to look up at the night sky to engage vision, listen to a specific piece of music, or boil a cinnamon stick to engage their sense of smell.
So it interrupts the circuit.
Yes, it forces the hyperactive panic brain to pause and anchor itself in the safe physical present without relying on tissue damage.
It's incredibly practical. Let's flip the coin on cluster B. We've looked at the emotional dysregulation of BPD, but the other side of this dramatic cluster is antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD. Historically, this is the clinical architecture behind what society calls sociopathy or psychopathy.
Where BPD is characterized by desperate attachment, ASPD is defined by a pervasive, chilling disregard for the rights of others.
Chilling is the right word.
These individuals are highly arrogant, entirely self-serving, and possess a profound lack of empathy. They operate under the firm conviction that societal rules, laws, and moral codes simply do not apply to them.
The case study provided for ASPD centers on a 55-year-old man named Danny. He's currently in an inpatient unit, transferred from the county jail after brutally assaulting his girlfriend.
And he openly tells the staff that rules are made to be broken.
Yeah. There is a piece of therapeutic dialogue in the file that perfectly captures his pathology. Danny approaches a psychiatric nurse and asks for a cigarette lighter.
Right.
The nurse calmly reminds him that smoking is not allowed on the unit. Danny pivots, claiming he doesn't want to smoke. He just wants to hold the lighter for later.
Just pushing the boundary.
Exactly. The nurse points out that she's required to confiscate his cigarettes as contraband. Danny immediately becomes defensive and hostile, but the nurse holds her boundary, and he eventually hands them over while aggressively complaining.
That interaction is a masterclass in the glib, superficial charm and relentless deceitfulness of ASPD. Danny didn't actually need the lighter right then.
Right, he was just testing the waters.
He was actively manipulating the nurse, testing the structural boundaries of the unit just to see if he could force her to break the rules for him. It's a game of control.
And where does that come from?
The origins of this pathology are a complex mix of biology and severe environmental failure. We consistently see difficult infant temperaments, babies who are hyperactive, inattentive, and aggressive.
Combined with bad environments.
Yes, combined with a total lack of secure childhood attachment, deeply chaotic family systems, and frequently a history of severe abuse or neglect.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The clinical material outlines a psychological phenomenon called assortive mating.
Yes, this is a very intense dynamic.
It details this incredibly chaotic magnetic attraction, specifically between men diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and women diagnosed with borderline personality disorder.
Assortive mating is the tendency for individuals with specific, often complementary pathological traits to be intensely drawn to one another. In this specific dynamic, you have a perfect, mutually destructive storm.
How so?
The individual with ASPD uses manipulation primarily to extract tangible resources, often physical sex, money, or total control over the environment.
Right.
The individual with BPD uses manipulation for an entirely different reason, to desperately secure emotional closeness and prevent abandonment.
So their needs are totally mismatched, but perfectly aligned for disaster.
Exactly. The cold, calculating, boundary-violating behavior of the ASPD partner constantly triggers the BPD partner's deepest fears of abandonment. This creates an explosive, highly dramatic cycle of drawing close and violently pushing away,
And they both kind of feed on it.
which both parties find deeply validating to their distorted worldviews.
It is a tragedy on a loop. Just to round out the dramatic and erratic behaviors of Cluster B, the texts also briefly detail histrionic personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. A fascinating piece of medical history here. The word histrionic derives from the ancient Greek word hystera, which means womb.
Yes, the wandering womb theory.
Historically, it was deeply misunderstood as a purely female hysteria. Today, it describes an individual who feels overwhelming discomfort if they are not the absolute center of attention, often utilizing highly theatrical, overly emotional, and sexually provocative behavior to maintain the spotlight.
And narcissistic personality disorder operates similarly, but with a different core motivation. It is characterized by grandiose fantasies, an inexhaustible need for external admiration, and a total inability to empathize with the experiences of others.
But they can actually be very successful, right?
Very. Because they are driven by a ruthless need to prove their superiority, individuals with this disorder are frequently highly successful in demanding competitive fields like corporate law or specialized medicine, even as their personal and familial relationships completely crumble around them.
Now, if Cluster B is about outward explosions and dramatic chaos, Cluster C is about implosion. This category covers the anxious and fearful disorders. It includes avoidant personality disorder, or AVPD, and dependent personality disorder, or DPD.
AVPD is particularly devastating because it actually causes the highest level of daily functional impairment of any personality disorder.
More than BPD or ASPD.
Yes. Unlike the schizoid individual who genuinely prefers to be alone, the person with AVPD desperately craves human connection. But they are paralyzed by a deeply ingrained core belief of their own inadequacy and a profound terror of rejection.
So they just hide.
They isolate themselves entirely to avoid the perceived inevitability of being criticized or embarrassed.
And what about dependent personality disorder?
DPD, on the other hand, manifests as an all-consuming terror of being alone or independent. These individuals will endure almost anything to maintain a relationship and are completely incapable of making even mundane daily decisions like what to wear or what to eat, without excessive advice and reassurance from others. This raises an important question, as the clinical text points out a massive societal misconception within this specific cluster. We have to clearly differentiate between obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, OCPD.
This is such a crucial distinction. People casually use OCD all the time to describe liking their desk organized or their color-coded spreadsheets. But actual OCD involves highly distressing, anxious obsessions, intrusive thoughts, and the repetitive compulsions used to temporarily relieve that severe anxiety. OCPD is structurally distinct.
Radically different. OCPD entirely lacks those anxious, intrusive obsessions. Instead, it is a rigid, almost joyless dedication to order, rules, and perfectionism. It is an inflexible worldview.
So they aren't afraid of a germ causing a disaster.
No. These individuals are completely devoted to productivity and efficiency at the total expense of leisure or human connection.
Think of that office manager who will literally grind an entire department to a halt because a memo used the wrong font size.
Perfect example.
The clinical text provides a highly relatable example of this. Someone with OCPD will plan a relaxing family vacation to the beach and turn it into a grueling, formalized itinerary. Every single minute is scheduled.
Right. There is no room for spontaneity.
If the family deviates from the plan by sleeping in for 20 minutes, the individual's world falls apart. It's not because they are avoiding a panic attack like an OCD. It's because they genuinely believe their highly structured, hyper-efficient way is the only correct way to exist. They lose the ability to actually enjoy the vacation.
They cannot turn it off.
That rigid control is a perfect pivot to our final clinical section. We've spent this entire time unpacking enduring, deeply ingrained personality traits. But what happens when the psychological brakes completely fail? The texts transition into impulse control disorders. This category strips away the long-term personality traits and focuses purely on the inability to resist an urge.
The defining clinical mechanism across all these disorders is the psychological tension release cycle. It operates like a pressure cooker.
Tension building up.
Exactly. First, there is a rising, uncomfortable internal tension or arousal. This anxiety builds and builds until the person finally commits the impulsive act.
And then what?
During the act itself, they experience a massive rush of gratification, pleasure, or relief. But the moment the act is over, that relief is almost immediately replaced by crushing remorse, deep regret, or self-reproach.
A prime example is intermittent explosive disorder, or IED. This goes far beyond having a bad temper. This is wildly disproportionate rage and physical aggression triggered by incredibly minor provocations.
Right.
Someone accidentally bumping into them at the grocery store results in a destructive, violent outburst. And then you have kleptomania. I have to share this historical fact. The term was actually coined by the French in 1838 to describe wealthy monarchs and kings who kept stealing totally worthless objects.
That historical context perfectly highlights the core pathology of kleptomania. These individuals do not steal because they need the item.
They already have everything.
Right. They don't steal because they can't afford it or to sell it for profit. The act of stealing is the psychological treatment for their mounting internal anxiety. The tension release comes purely from the illicit act of taking the object, which is why the objects themselves are often hoarded, thrown away, or secretly returned.
And finally, the text outlines pyromania, the irresistible urge to set fires.
The vital distinction with pyromania is the motivation. These individuals are not setting fires for political ideology, for insurance money, or to cover up a crime. They possess a deep, intrinsic fascination with fire itself.
So it's the cycle again.
Exactly. The tension release cycle is fulfilled by preparing the fire, setting it, and often standing in the crowd to witness the destructive aftermath.
So what does this all mean? We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, looking at some extreme clinical realities, from Rebecca's frantic self-harm to Danny's cold manipulation to the exhausting rigidity of OCPD. But we have to return to the mission we established at the beginning. These dramatic behaviors exist on the exact same continuum as normal human behavior.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, possessing this knowledge is incredibly empowering. The goal isn't to walk around diagnosing your coworkers or your family members.
Please don't do that.
Right. The goal is to foster a deeper, more profound empathy. When you understand the mechanics of the biosocial theory, perhaps you become hyper-aware of not inadvertently creating an invalidating environment for your own highly sensitive child.
Like with little Emily.
Precisely. When you understand the rigid architecture of OCPD, you can recognize that a colleague's impossible perfectionism isn't a personal attack against you, it's their own joyless trap.
It changes your whole perspective.
Understanding these invisible mechanisms helps us navigate the world with significantly more compassion, while simultaneously allowing us to set firm, healthy boundaries to protect our own well-being.
Compassion and boundaries, the ultimate tools for navigating human relationships. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We started this deep dive by looking at the Greek origin of our topic, the persona, the theatrical mask.
The mask we all wear.
If severe personality disorders are essentially defense mechanisms, masks that have become rigidly, tragically superglued to a person's face through a combination of biology and childhood trauma, it really makes you question the architecture of your own normal personality.
A profound question.
Take a hard look at how you operate at work, in your relationships, in your private moments. How much of the mask you wear every single day is actually the authentic you, and how much of it is just a set of comfortable, learned habits that you've simply forgotten you have the power to take off. Think about it. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.